all said and done. So I just need to unmute you. Just a second. Yeah, please unmute yourself. Yeah. So,
thank you.
Yeah, we're good to go.
Good evening and welcome everyone to the fourth session of the ongoing Majha House Winter Festival. We plan to bring you eclectic, beautifully curated conversations and talks each weekend this month of January. Do allow Majha House to enter your homes with this huge intellectual feast and satiate your cravings for debate and discussion, conversation and interaction with some of the most brilliant writers and ideators in India and elsewhere. Today, we have an award-winning novel by Manreet Sodhi Someshwar, a novel that talks about trauma, about violence, about memory, talks about partition and the pogrom of 1984 through the story of a young woman named Nikki Nalva. She's the daughter of a lawyer who decides that she must finish her father's novel. Her father's been documenting stories of survivors of partition and 1984, and Nikki has been helping him to transcribe these testimonies. And then when her father passes away, she takes up the task of finishing this monumental work that he's begun. And then as she proceeds to do this, Nikki learns of the silences surrounding many of these searing stories that she's hearing. And as she moves along in her own life, and she is a wife, she's a mother, she's a daughter. But this novel and the telling of all of these stories, the novel that her father is writing, the book that her father is writing, this is constantly present in her life and it stays with her, much like a sibling. This became a really personal, very, very strong story. Manreet's earlier novel, which I remember reading some years ago, The Long Walk, was a novel again which has stayed with me. And I remember that at the time that I bought it, after I read it, I wrote this long note inside it and I gave it to my dad. So it's really something that spoke to me. Manreet lives in New York, so good morning to her. It's very early. And this is her fifth novel. She's an alumnus of the IIM in Calcutta. And she's worked in advertising and marketing before switching to writing. The Brilliance of a Thousand Suns, the novel.
I think probably there's some network error with Preeti ji. So
Like I said, it's got really strong women characters, and they're not just strong, they speak to you, and they're actually, I mean, you really identify with them, and I think we'll hear more of them as we go along. Talking to her today best-selling author. She's based in Mumbai. She's a TEDx speaker, columnist, and mentor with Vital Voices. She was earlier a features writer for Times of India and Cosmopolitan India, and she wears many hats. She's also done a fantastic book on parenting, and I'm hoping we'll get her to talk about that as well in a later session. So over to you now, Kiran. Please take the conversation forward, and thank you very much for both of you for being here, and to our audience for being here with us this evening.
Thank you for that kind introduction, Preeti, and it's always a delight to be in conversation with Manreet. This is a book that I read when it came out, and it has stayed with me so strongly, as you said, along with her very first book, which was Long Walk Home. And I'm so delighted to see it receive the accolades it has today. Congratulations, Manreet, on all the awards that the book has received. Very, very well deserved indeed. And I'll start right off, Manreet, by asking you a question, and then I'd like you to read a bit from the book, because I think it's important to set the context in which the book was written for you. Because as the title of your first book goes, you know, it has been a long journey for you as well as a writer. Your very first book, which also dealt with a similar background and setting, and then you went through so many other books, your thrillers, your chiclets, but you returned to this theme again. So, what has the journey been for you as a writer before you dared, I would say, dared take on a theme and a canvas like Radiance?
Thank you, Kiran. Thank you, Preeti, as well, for inviting me to join this lovely session in Majha House. Um, I envy the work that you're doing. It's so phenomenal, to be able to get people to talk, especially during the time of pandemic, and to bring everybody homes alive with such intellectually vigorous discussions. And Kiran, it's always lovely to be in conversation with you. We go back a long way, and it's such a joy when you have a friend who's also a writer and a brilliant writer such as yourself. So to answer your question, I think I would have to go back to my hometown. I feel if I hadn't been born in this place, I wouldn't be a writer. And the town is called Firozpur. It's on the border, smack on the border between India and Pakistan. And I have always thought that kind of stands Janus faced. Janus is this sort of mythological character who's two-faced. He doesn't know really which side he belongs to. And the reason for that is that Firozpur was a Muslim majority town. So at the time of India's partition, by the laws of partition, it should have gone to Pakistan. But there's an immense amount of speculation as to why it didn't, and I won't delve into it right now. But the result was that, sort of the infamous migrations that happened post-partition did. And Firozpur is very much a known Muslim majority town. But as a result of it, when I was growing up, there were so many conversations which I eavesdropped on because people wouldn't publicly sort of talk about these events. And especially women's conversations would sort of peter off, at strategic points. There would be these silences, which as a child I never understood. And then, of course, we had the period of militancy in Punjab in the 80s. And I was an adolescent at that time. I witnessed it very closely. My father was a lawyer, a criminal lawyer. And he was, at that time, it was very common for the police to knock on doors, pick up young boys and take them away. And we had at that time something called the TADA, which was an act, TADA Act, which was in place. So under TADA, you could not even have access to bail or have the regular judicial procedures. So as a result of that, I was seeing it very close, but when you're a child, you have other things on your mind. You have physics and math and tests, and it sort of just all washed over me. It's only when I moved out of Punjab and I went to IIM Calcutta and then I started working. I had a corporate career largely out of Mumbai. And it's around that time that some of those memories came back to me. And what's called the terrible decade of Punjab, it's actually more than a decade. It's 15 years, certainly, if not longer. And at some point around the turn of the millennium is when my husband's work took him out of Bombay and we went to Singapore. And it was in Singapore that I took a break from my corporate career because I wanted to have some me time. My jobs had been very hectic, involving a lot of travel. And we still didn't have a daughter at the time. So I thought, I'll just take some time off, like, do what women of leisure do, like a pedicure at 11 a.m. in the morning. And, but within 2 months, our house was set, and Singapore is just such a beautiful, orderly, spick and span place that, my husband would leave early in the morning. I would sit with my second cup of tea, and I just had these memories which had started to surface. And I had recently lost my father as well. And I think I was just homesick, nostalgia. And I thought I'll just write a short story, This is somebody who had just been used to PowerPoint presentations. So I had no inkling of what creative writing really is. But I got down to writing a story and I really enjoyed it. And I thought maybe I'll write another. And the 6 months of sabbatical was over before I realized. And I thought, I'm having such a good time, why not extend it? That became a year, our daughter arrived. And by that time, I realized that it was not just a short story, there was something more that I wanted to explore. And I realized I didn't have the answers. So, I began my trek to the Singapore Public Library. And then I realized I didn't have the answers that I was looking for even there. So, which took me back to Firozpur, to the people I had known growing up, my mother. And to cut a long story short, I spent 7 years researching, reworking draft because I was teaching myself to write as well. And my second published book, The Long Walk Home, was born. And as you said, Kiran, it has just been, that came out in 2009. And The Radiance of a Thousand Suns came out exactly 10 years later in 2019. And I think with The Long Walk Home, what I was attempting, I'm glad I didn't do because I was just terribly unequipped for it. One, I didn't understand most of the history. I didn't know how to write. I had to teach myself to write. But the germ of that idea had always been with me. But the research had taken so much out of me that I wrote what I thought were sort of lighter novels, which was thrillers and women-centric fiction. And then in 2014, I'll blame my husband again. We again moved, and this time we were moving to the other end of the world. We moved to the US. And we are in New York, and it's a lovely place, but help is difficult to come by. And as I told my husband, budape mein I'm learning how to run the dishwashers and washing machines, and this isn't fair. But I was at that time working on the third book of what is the Mehrunissa trilogy, which is the book one is the Taj Conspiracy, the Hunt for Kohinoor, and I was working on the third book, but there was this sort of break, disruption that happened. And then I think it was New York City, and I was exposed to a very different set of stimuli, the diaspora, the fact that, one of my earliest interactions, we got into a yellow cab and the cabbie just turned and says, Kiddan. And my daughter, who was 12 at the time, was totally freaked out. She was like, and she's grown up outside of India. And she was like, this is so creepy. How does this guy even know you're a Punjabi? How does he? And, of course, once we got out, we spoke in Punjabi. And once we got out, I told her, like, this is the reason why you should learn Punjabi. You can go anywhere and talk with people. But the fact is that it is a known statistic that in New York City, the cab drivers, 50% of them, the surname or the last name is Singh, and the first name is Mohammed. So it tells you where the cabbies come from, right? It's and that exposure to the diaspora, the idea that there were so many Punjabis here, men and women, who had been there because of the 80s, because of what happened during 1984, and thereafter, sort of the persecutions in Punjab. And as I felt a desire to know more, to talk to those people, to learn. And then I came across this factoid that, the very first victim of the hate crime after 9/11 was a Sikh, was a turban Sardar in Arizona. And the fact is that for most Americans, brown and turbaned is an Arab. The idea that it could be somebody who's not an Arab never strikes them. That's sort of the level of awareness. And I felt that I wanted to explore that idea more. So anyway, to cut a long story short, I spent a lot of time meeting people, talking to them, and I figured that maybe I could begin to tell the story, which I had kind of left out while talking about The Long Walk Home. And it was a very ambitious canvas, as you said, because I wanted to really look at the 20th century, the 100 years of India, and certainly the 70 years or 75 years of our independent modern Indian history. But I wanted to tell it through the voices of people, which is unheard. Our history is a very his story. It's always all the great men of history story. And I want to talk about those voices which aren't heard, and they are largely women's voices. And that's why, the voices of the women that I was hearing and still not hearing fully when I was growing up. So I want to try in all those threads and see what her story, for instance, would look like, what it would tell us, which we hadn't heard. Yeah, so that's how it was born.
That's how it was born, Manreet, and that's how you wove in so many strands that go from here and Draupadi to Nikki. The back and forth and the interweaving of the past and the present is so beautifully done in this book. But since you spoke of her story, would you like to read a bit about, I think, one of the most powerful characters in your book, which is Noora? And she's a character who is like the invisible man, someone who normally never gets a voice in most of our stories, but you portray her so beautifully. So let's just hear a bit from the book about Noora.
Sure, it would be really a pleasure to read a short piece, except I'll read from the early on in the novel. For those of you who haven't seen, it's The Radiance of a Thousand Suns. And Noora is the time when I'm starting to read, it is early 80s, and Noora is a woman around 30 years old, 35 years old. She lives in the Nalva household, and she was taken in as a young orphan girl. She's a Muslim girl by the Nalva household, and she's raised there. But she's like, a member of the family. So Noora is the moral compass of the story. And if you read the book, you will discover how and why that is. And I'll just read you briefly from this chapter. It's chapter 2. The year is 1982. Noora hated flies and God, in that order. In 1947, returning from the field of death at the age of 9, Noora had carried two things with her: the stench of carrion and the drone of flies. This was why Noora always walked on a whiff of attar, a plastic swatter dangling from the corner of her dupatta. Even in the most immaculate Punjabi household, a fly or two was inevitable, as elemental as summer heat, but not in the house of her Biji Nalva. The swatter wore out every 2 summers and was the only item Noora required replacing on a regular basis, not the steel colander or the plastic buckets or the ceramic jars. The only time the swatter was not on Noora's person was when she stepped out of home. In every way, though, Noora was an anomaly. Punjab prized fairness, but she was dark as the underside of a griddle and nonchalant about it. Punjabi women tiptoed around their menfolk, but Noora strode about like an unapologetic peacock. In a land where multiple gods were invoked in one breath, non-belief was deviant behavior in need of correction. But Noora would wrinkle her nose and declare, "I encountered God long ago, he stinks." Now Noora took off her dupatta with the swatter, picked a floral one, red and white flowers emblazoned on the long white scarf, bolted the door of her house and stepped out. Nikki's bus would arrive any minute at the end of the lane on which their house stood. At 1 p.m., the 5-year-old would be drowsy and would need to be carried home. Nikki had begun big school, which meant 6 hours of study and time enough to tire an adult. A bumblebee buzzed in the shade of the guava tree, its fruit ripening in the autumn sun. A bus pulled up. Laughter spilled out of its open windows and door. Noora mounted the steps and scanned the seated children, the older ones chatting and the younger ones in various stages of slumber. Nikki was slumped against a window, her school bag slack by her side. Noora hoisted Nikki upon one shoulder, the bag on the other, and exited the bus. Nikki was getting bigger, her feet now dangling down Noora's thighs. She smiled at the observation as she strolled down the lane. The next instant, her breast was groped, the school bag slid from her shoulder, and a bicycle sailed by, the man on it looking back at her, twisting his mouth in a lurid kiss. Noora was incandescent with rage. She steadied herself, aware that Nikki had been jolted awake. The school bag was on the ground, while the man was pedaling leisurely on. Helping Nikki stand up, Noora bent, plucked something from the gravel, and hurled it in the direction of the bicycle. An "Aye" rang out, the cycle wobbled, the man hunched in pain as the stone found its mark. He cast a wary look behind, and Noora pretended to bend again. He pedaled as if chased by a rabid dog. "Coward," Noora spat. "What happened?" Nikki asked, wide-eyed. Noora grabbed the school bag, and with Nikki's hand clutched in hers, they marched down the lane. I taught him a lesson. What lesson? Nikki skipped as she walked. When a man is violent, not every woman will remain silent. Sighting the gate, Nikki ran ahead, stood on its bottom railing, reached for the latch, and swung backwards with the opening gate. Her red ribbon plaits danced as she raced down the path to the front door on her chubby legs. Noora, meanwhile, watching her progress with affection, absent-mindedly reached for the air with both her hands, curling them as she tucked them to the sides of her head. Shorthand for drawing towards herself any evil that might befall Nikki. In a land where violence could surface unexpectedly, mothers had learned to ransom themselves for their children. I'll end it there. It's chapter 2 in the book.
Lovely, absolutely lovely. Noora is such a strong, brilliant character, Manreet. And when I read of her, I thought that, we have so many Nooras around us who we've perhaps grown up with, perhaps seen in our lives, but never really thought about their backstories or what made them what they are. And along with Noora, there are so many strong women in your book. Your book is a feminist narrative of sorts. And you did speak just now before you read the excerpt about how you wanted to make this a book about the narratives of those that don't get spoken out, that don't get a voice. So when you were drafting it, when you were planning it, plotting it, how did your characters fall into place? How did the Noora would be here and she would have her say. Nikki would be the anchor. Jyoth would be there. She would have her story. BT would be there. How did this entire tapestry come about? Did you want to represent different generations? Did you want to represent different lifestyles? How did this whole thing weave together?
That's a wonderful question, Kiran. I wish I could give a very succinct answer because I stumbled around for so long. But let me try and backtrack and see, draw the journey that I went through. So as I said, I figured that I, wanted to tell the stories of women. I also didn't want to do it like a short story collection because I wanted to look at the passage of time. I think I wanted to show how it is a spiral, how we, which is, us as a civilization, women, men, we are caught in a spiral that we don't seem to be getting out of. So the passage of time was important. I also knew I wanted to cover a wide canvas, and I knew, therefore, there would be multiple generations involved. But how would I begin, and who was the voice that I could sort of say would lead me into the narrative? Very often people don't realize that the writer themselves are sort of discovering for themselves a narrative as they sort of begin crafting it and writing it. So what I was doing was I was talking to people, in the diaspora here. And I met this person. I came across the story of a person who had who after 9/11, this is a Punjabi woman who wears salwar kameez and comes to these homes in Manhattan to cook. And she had faced abuse after 9/11, whereas earlier, she never had to wear trousers and dress up like a known, visibly foreigner. So when I was talking with these people, I realized that, and for Long Walk Home, what I had done, which was go back and speak to the women that I had seen while growing up. And I started, so every year we go back to India, and I started doing the same thing, seeking out a lot of the women that I'd spoken to earlier and other people that they were able to put me in touch with, just to understand, what the experiences were in 47, what happened in 1984. In 1984, we were in Punjab, and to an extent, I think, safe, because what happened outside of Punjab after Mrs. Gandhi's passing is an entirely different story. And I realized that a lot of times when I was speaking with these women, that there were no answers which were forthcoming. And I realized that, obviously I was dealing with trauma, and people who have been through trauma, who have suffered trauma, there's a certain approach that you have with them. There is a certain way that you can hope to talk and unravel what they want to say. And I realized I didn't have the skills for that. So I turned towards trauma studies. I took a course to understand, how people who have been victims of trauma. How do you approach them? What is, so this was like an entire 6 months spent with a wonderful professor on trauma studies, which gave me an idea of, kind of a tools that I could use. It also deepened my own understanding. And it was around the time that I stumbled again upon a short story. It's called The Shawl. It's by Cynthia Ozick. And it's a story I recommend to just about everybody. Later she developed it to a novella, but the short story is available online. So I would encourage people to read it. It's a Holocaust, based in the Holocaust. And while I was reading it, suddenly something crystallized in me. And, all those witness testimonials, the research, the talking to people, it all seemed to crystallize because I saw in that Jyot, who is sort of the spine of the book, because Jyot is a person who suffers during 1947 and during 1984 as well. And that is not unusual. There are people who suffered both of these catastrophes. And reading that story sort of brought Jyot right center and up front for me. And I knew that this was the person who would lead me into the narrative. And once I started weaving Jyot's story, what is her background? What happened to her in 47? What was her life till 84? What happens now? Why does she come to the US? And as I was doing that, there were other characters who were coming to me. And, the idea of BG and Nikki and the Nalva household. And of course, basing it out of Firozpur, because as I say, you can find Firozpur in each of my books. And Firozpur is just a wonderful sort of setting for, I think, a lot of the narrative of Punjab in the 20th century, of a place which doesn't really know, does it belong? There's Lahore, there is Amritsar, and there is Firozpur sort of hanging in the middle. And so I was doing this, and again, it took me multiple drafts. It took me various rewritings. And I mentioned in the acknowledgements in the Radiance that, that dialogue from Damini came to me only in my own writerly version, which was that draft pe draft likhti gayi, lekin manuscript nahi mila. Until finally, at some point it did, and a lot of writing is rewriting. It is just working with your own craft and sort of sharpening it. And by the end, I knew, and I had these sort of 5 strong female characters. 3 of them are, of course, from the Nalva household, which is BG. She's the grandmother, and she brings up Nikki because Nikki's mother dies in childbirth. And then Nikki's daughter, Meher. So there are 3 women of the Nalva household. There's Noora, who's part of the Nalva household as well. And there is Jyot, who's the spine of the book. And of course, because as you say, it's a feminist narrative, and I was not content with just these women. I had to bring in Draupadi and Heer. And to be very honest, you cannot be a Punjabi and be telling a feminist narrative and not have Heer. I mean, Heer's story, Heer by Waris Shah, is, I think, one of the foremost sort of feminist narratives that we have. And, when you grow up in Punjab, listening to Heer being sung is such a joy. And I knew that I had to get sort of these women as well into the narrative. And yeah, so all these women are there and they're telling their stories. And the other thing I was very clear on was that a lot of times, since the story is about violence and silence, and violence is committed by men on women, and the silence is the women's to bear, a lot of times the violence against women is shown in a manner that is like a trope. And I wanted to make sure that it was women's voices and they were speaking and they were telling their stories, in which case they have, the authority, they have the power to tell their stories. Yeah, so
it's really lovely. I mean, I've read your previous book as well and this one, and I feel there has been the women's voice has definitely been much stronger here, and but we've had we've had women writing on partition, the horrors. Have any of them inspired your work? Anyway, we've had Amrita Preetham, for instance, who's written such wonderful works on it. So have you taken any kind of inspiration from their works, from their narratives, which have been women-centric as well?
Absolutely. As I like to say, I came to Khushwant Singh's Train to Pakistan very late in life. And it just blew my mind when I read it, which was in Singapore. I'm ashamed to say that, I was much older and I got to that book so late. But it told me more about the history of partition and what had happened than all my history books combined. And of course, Amrita Preetham's Aaj Aankhan Waaris Shanu, it's sort of the poem which has been beautifully recited by so many people, including Gulzar Saab. It tells you volumes in those 8 to 10 lines. And then, of course, in Amrita Preetham's writing itself, Krishna Sobti. And there are these wonderful women writers who are not Indian, but Toni Morrison, for instance, her beloved, the novel Beloved is such a wonderful, wonderful novel on trauma, on Black trauma. And there is another novel which I recommend to people. It's a graphic book, and it's by a man called Art Spiegelman. It's called Mouse, which is about the Holocaust. And it's again a wonderful retelling. It taught me so much about how one can write about trauma, without making it something which is heavy and leaden, and how we bring stories alive. So I do feel, along with all this, there are these countless Punjabi Sufi poets and ghazal lyricists and singers who I owe an immense sort of gratitude to, because growing up in Punjab, in the town that I was in, I was exposed to Urdu. My father was of the generation where he wrote and spoke Urdu. And all of these, I think it's very difficult to pinpoint a particular person, but all of these have gone into sort of informing my own writing and all that I have sort of written, even Radiance, Long Walk Home, and other books besides it. And I think we're very fortunate in India, we don't realize, but once I came to the US, I realized that most Indians are trilingual, or if not fluent in 4 or 5 languages. And when you're in the US and people speak English and that is it. I mean, the idea that, for instance, I started learning Spanish here because I get mistaken for a Hispanic all the time. People come up to me and say, habla español. And I'm like, oh, well, then I have to say, I tell back, no habla español. And they're like, no, but you just spoke Spanish. So, but it is such a privilege to have access to other languages, to understand, things, because every idiom is so different, and the ability to, sort of access all those languages, as I said, for me, though I don't read Urdu, but the ability to understand Urdu, I really sort of consider it a privilege.
It also brings me to something that I've been wondering, because we got acquainted when you had your first Taj Conspiracy book out, and it's been a journey since then. You were in Singapore back then. Now you moved to New York. Do you think this distance, now becoming a writer of the diaspora, so to speak, has impacted your writing? Did it give you a kind of change your lens from which you viewed the entire partition, 1984? Did it give you that dispassionate objectivity towards it, to be able to write it? Because it can be very traumatic. I'm sure it's very traumatic researching all that you did and getting all those narratives together and then distilling it into your story. So did the distance help you in any way, or did it give you that kind of a funnel through which you could pool your story, your narrative?
Yeah, I think it does. As I said, I started writing when I moved out of India. So that in itself, I think the longing for home, but the physical distance, I think, was sort of the first trigger. I do feel that distance helps because, once, at least with me, if I'm right smack in the middle of it and I'm reading newspapers and the daily headlines, they can distract you from what writing requires, which is a deep immersion. I like to say it's like a hibernation. And my family is aware of it. My daughter always complains that when you start a first draft, we lose you for so many months. Do you know that? And my husband will say at the end of the day that the quality of the meal tells him how good a writing day I had. So, it is such an immersive experience because you have to go deep into it. You have to go deep into yourself. So you're sort of kind of shutting yourself off to other stimuli. And it's easier if, like in New York City, there is very little coverage, honestly, about India, even less about, let's say a Punjab. And in a sense, it's good. It helps me, sort of keeps my area of work to me. It is something for me to work with and troll through. I think it's important, though, obviously, to know what one is writing about. And as I said, I'm always, we've never sort of left India really. We're back every year. I go at times twice a year. My mother is there. I go back to Firozpur every year. And, to be able to talk to people on the ground and know what's happening is certainly very important to me. But I think as a writer for myself, I've had a 20-year-long journey now. I think the idea is also you mature. I've become a mother. My daughter is now 18 years old. She teaches me more than I would like to learn on most days. But, it's a journey. And I think the distance certainly helps, certainly for the first draft writing of it.
I found that very interesting that you mentioned, the immersiveness of writing your first draft and the meals, the quality of the meals telling you how far gone that you are in the stage of your writing. So, given that Radiance is such an intense book and the research process has been must have been very, very trying for you and traumatic as well, because you did go through a process to learn about how to speak to and interact with trauma victims. What was the emotional toll on you, Manreet? It couldn't have been easy, taking so many stories and so many narratives. And how do you deal with this as a writer? Because it can weigh down your fiction, right? When there's so much of trauma that you have to process.
Yeah, Kiran, that's a very relevant question. And I think any writer, once they are close to their material, which all of us really are, have also to reach a point where you have to kind of start distancing yourself from the material. And what I mean by it is, as you said, once, I was going through all those testimonials, researching, writing it all down. At the end of the day, I still, you live in a society. I'm a mother, I'm a wife, I have friends. And there is a way that one has to learn to sort of start carving those times out and say, this role is over, now I'm doing this. I think it helps that I have a very understanding family, or the fact that over 20 years they've seen that there is no way she's going to improve. But there's something I discovered, and I think it works for me as a writer, that when I talk about all these sort of epochal events, and obviously there is no epochal event which is not followed by suffering. And as it happens in life, women always bear the brunt of that suffering. I figured that the way for me to write these narratives is through love and relationships. And, even when I was growing up, for instance, as I say, I owe a lot to the family and the town I was brought up in. I had very strong women around me. And when I would read, as you said, literature, I wouldn't find those women. So I wanted to bring those women, they are living Draupadi's and he around us. And I wanted to bring them alive on the narrative. And these strong women raised me, and when women are there, there are stories, there is laughter, there is love, there is food, all these things, and I wanted to capture that. And that's my way when I write about events which are disturbing to some people, but I bring them alive by weaving them through relationships, because I think that's the prism. I mean, in the end, all of life and its narrative is about the relationships that we have with people. And as long as I think there is love that is refracted through it, it helps us see it better. It helps us read it better. I mean, for instance, even Heer's story is finally, it's a love story. It's a story about her love. And it's a trauma narrative. So, there you go. You have the formula.
That's beautifully said. I never really thought of Heer's story as a trauma narrative, but that sort of changed my perspective towards it. The fact is, Manreet, that we do have a lot of writing on the partition, but somehow the wounds have not yet healed. We're still processing, we're still trying to find closure, as we were discussing the other day. And I think the generation still calls it Batwara. They will not say independence, they will not say Azadi, they still say Batwara. Why do you think we are still not reconciled to the horrors, or we've not really accepted what we've gone through with partition? And what is the role of the creative person or the writer or the artist in this to help us find some closure?
Yeah, yeah, Bhatwara, as you said, Kiran. So the thing is that I've come 15th August every year. We celebrate the independence of India, which is a valid, absolutely legitimate celebration. But we also kind of don't remember or don't memorialize the concomitant partition. There's no one without the other. And the fact is that um, in India, we don't really memorialize partition. Until the Partition Museum came up in Amritsar a few years back, we had nothing. We had no testimonial to the massive upheaval that happened in 1947. I mean, it is regarded as the largest migration in modern human history. Close to 15 million people displaced, and most of it was done within 6 months. In fact, the majority happened during the first 3 months. And close to, the figures differ, but 1 to 3 million perished. And these didn't perish because of lack of water or, sort of being struck with flu or malaria. They were killed. These were people who turned upon each other. They were brothers who turned upon brothers, neighbors who turned upon neighbors. And the thing is that in most, so to answer your question, I will try and give a little background as to why I think we have an essential problem with why we do not speak about it. And then, of course, the idea of speaking up about it. So, for instance, when you look at the Jewish Holocaust narrative, there is a very clear enemy. It was the German, the Reich, which was on one side, and the Jewish people on the other side. You take, the narrative of Black trauma in the United States, it's very clear. It's the white supremacists, many times the white folks, and the Black African Americans who were brought in as slaves. It's very clear. We know who is on which side. You take apartheid in South Africa. We know what was happening. It was the natives and again, the white colonizers. But when we come to the violence of partition, we have no clear villain. The villain is each one of us, because this was, if you take take Lahore. Lahore was a city which was, sort of Muslim majority, but it had a very large non-Muslim population, Sikhs and Hindus. It was a city in which sort of the economic enterprise was with the non-Muslims, but a lot of the cultural enterprise was with Muslims. So what I'm trying to say is that Punjab, for instance, not just Lahore, Punjab as a whole, was a place in which the Hindu, Muslim, Sikhs were very closely nestled with each other, whether it is housing, the houses where they're located, whether it's the language, when it's the names, the Iqbal Chand, Iqbal Singh, Iqbal Malik, now the Iqbal, if you say Iqbal, it could be any of those. It's the surname which might give you an idea. A Malik can be a Hindu, a Muslim, a Sikh as well. So what I'm trying to say is that in this kind of a place like Punjab, to have the eruption of partition violence, what it saw was that the person who was your neighbor, whom the children would call Tayaji or Chachaji, depending on whether he was older to your father or not, was the person who came to your house and killed you, and vice versa. And once, it was all sort of done and we moved on, we really moved on. And the only way we can move on is by saying that I won't remember it, I won't talk about it. Because if I have been complicit in violence, then how do I tell my children, what did I do? They threw me out of my house, but I went and, killed 10 people there. How do I own up to that kind of violence? So I think there is that thing. It's truly the Mahabharata in a sense playing out, right? It's brother against brother. It's the blood of the other, as Bhim says, when in that scene, he says, I will drink the blood of my brother, and which is exactly what we did. And I think that's one reason why we don't want to talk about it, because there is no easy person to blame. And the other thing is that since we don't talk about it, we have that trauma still with us. And that trauma, any basic trauma study would tell you that the people who suffer trauma are the ones who will then wreak trauma on others. It's a spiral. It doesn't end. And the only way to break that spiral is to talk about it. And there we come up with the next issue, which is that a lot of the violence that happened was borne by women. Women were brutalized, they were sexualized, and women's testimonies were not recorded. There are very few testimonies available. And in one of the few accounts, which is, when women talked about trauma, they obviously talk using euphemisms. They say, I was badly used. And most of the people who are recording those testimonials are men. So either they don't understand or they don't want to record that the woman has been raped. So there is this, the idea again, it's again, Draupadi, the Vastraharan, the fact that to make the men suffer, you will make the woman suffer, which is again the template which played out in 1947, which played out in 1984, and countless other what we call communal violence in India, which is really pogrom, which is one turning upon the other. And I think the only way, we can break this is by talking about it. And I'm speaking from experience because when I went and spoke to a lot of the trauma victims, there was an elderly woman who lashed out at me, who said, why do you want to bring up these stories? Why do you want to talk about it? Because, it's like the Hindi Punjabi word khuredna. You're actually scouring it. You're working it over and over. But the fact that the scab isn't going to go away. So unless we make it part of our national mainstream conversation and bring it up, we're not going to see an end to it. And I'm afraid that we're witnessing it very much in the public domain in India right now.
Which also brings me to 1984, Manreet. You've placed it beautifully. I mean, it's such a spine-chilling scene in which, the entire program unfolds in your book with the turban, the yellow turban. The scene is very vivid in my head right now. I won't give any spoilers to the listeners. But the fact is that the victims spoke about 1984, but they didn't get heard. There has been no hearing, there has been no closure, and it's still going on since so many years. Do you think narratives in fiction make it easier to talk about trauma, about these events, bring it more mainstream, have conversations around it? Is that one reason why you chose to set these as pivot points within your narrative?
Yeah, Kiran, again, great question. I think, when we look at 1984, which certainly is more recent than 1947, and I could go on with 1991 and 2002 and so many others that have followed. But for my purpose of my narrative, I wanted to keep a generation which has witnessed 47 and 84. And as I said, Jyot has been a victim of both and therefore is sort of the central spine of the book. And also 1984 is something I witnessed very closely. I was an adolescent at that time. I was seeing what is happening in Punjab. And then, there was a curfew. This was not the time of social media, no cell phones. And for 3 days, there was sort of a blanket. All we were getting were rumors, and we were tuning into BBC radio to understand what was happening in Delhi and beyond. And I do think that the fact that 1984 is recent enough, the fact that there were people who went and started recording witness testimonials very quickly, certainly in Delhi and in other places, the fact that these are available online, people can just search. The PUCL and PUDR did incredible work. It's Madhu Kishwar's testimonials from that time that she collected. It's all available online. And I am amazed at the chilling preciseness of those testimonials. In 2 lines, a woman will sum up the devastation that has happened to her family, to her children. I'll just mention, for instance, bring up one thing, which, many things have stayed with me, but the women said, the men were killed, the women were brutalized, children who were younger than 7, 8 were spared. A lot of women braided their sons' hair to make them look like girls. And when after 4 or 5 days, they were taken to camps in Delhi. This is the government and the army was called out. They're taking the children to the camps, the women to the camps. And the women said, we survived those 5 years because you could not step out for food or water. The men folk, their bodies were smoldering outside. And again, the flies that Noura saw in 1947 were there. The women could not go out, and they said, we kept our children alive by feeding them, you don't have water. So they were collecting their urine and giving it to them. So the idea, there is chilling precision in these testimonials of what women are talking about. And I just, I think it's difficult for most people to read them. And what a story does is it gives you a context. It allows you, gives you permission to say, come, sit, I will tell you a story. And through the story, then you can draw people in. And people are always vested when I will care for a character, when that character has become known to me. So if a woman just says, as I gave you that chilling statement, but if I know that woman, if I can see her in her house, if I see how she takes care of her children, if I see her love her husband, smile at him, when he ties his turban and, she, sort of fixes something about his collar before he steps out, then I have an intimacy, I have a relationship as a reader with that character. And then it's easier, in a sense, to bring those other epochal events and trauma events which have happened in their life. And hopefully, through that, make the reader care for them. But I also feel as a people, as a society, we are remiss. I mean, there are such few narratives around 1984.
Exactly.
Gulzar Saab's movie is one, certainly. And there's a brilliant film by a woman director, and the name is just escaping me. But beyond that, why are we not talking about it? It is our history. Why do we not want to share these stories? And, the moment we share them is the moment we can talk about it, right? I mean, however bad a film is or a book is, if there is conversation around it, we moved a point, from point one to the next point. So yes, I do believe we as artists, can talk about it, but at the same time, all artists have to respond to what speaks to them. So, if Game of Thrones speaks to somebody, then they should do Game of Thrones. And if this is what speaks to somebody, that's what they should do. All these are stories to be told.
Absolutely. And stories are what keep us going. I'm going to ask you one last question on Radiance, and then I'll ask you about your forthcoming work. I want to know how the title came about, because it's, of course, a quote from the Gita. And how did you think about Radiance of a Thousand Suns in consonance with your narrative? Was there a moment when it fell together and you said, this is it? Because it's such a brilliant title.
Thank you. Yes, in fact, it did. As you said, through the book, the Mahabharata through the book is kind of a leitmotif. It weaves the various strands together. And I said it's because thematically it's the violence of a brother against brother, which is in the backdrop. And in the Mahabharata, in the Gita, there's definitely a point where Arjun is on the battlefield and he's losing his nerve, and Krishna comes and shows his celestial form. And so there is, this has been quote was taken by one of the fathers of Manhattan Project when they're making the atomic bomb in the US. And he quoted it as well. And so the book is set in New York. It is, it uses the leitmotif of the Mahabharata and therefore the radiance of a thousand suns. And it is also Nuran. The name literally means somebody who's very radiant, who has the radiance of a thousand suns. And for me, Noora she has that kind of radiance. And then I also link it with Meher, who's Nikki's daughter, who weaves it in. So yes, I'm glad you like the title, because when there were people who told me it's too close to Khalid Hosseini's title, Thousand Splendid Suns. And it is, because Hosseini's title also refers to the Mahabharata, and as in that's where he derives it from. But I think it's even better because it tells you how, as a subcontinent, certainly, we are all connected by that foundational epic of the Mahabharata. So, I'm glad it works, because I think for me, it captures all the strands of my book and puts it together.
Lovely. Manreet, I do know that you always follow up a very intense book with a light one. So you had Girl in the City, but are we going to expect another intense one for you now after The Girl in the City is already out and doing brilliantly? So what are you working on right now? What's on in your drafts?
Yeah, Kiran, thank you for asking that question, because I am so excited about my current project. It's a trilogy, it's 3 books, and it's called the Partition Trilogy. And I'm hoping once I've done that, I've exorcised my demons and I've sent them off and I can move on to other pastures. But so the Partition Trilogy is it's 3 books called Lahore, Hyderabad, and Kashmir. And what I'm doing in that is really, the narrative is told in 2 strands in each book. For instance, let's start with Lahore. In Lahore, I'm looking at the 9 months leading up to the independence and partition of India. And in Hyderabad and Kashmir, I'm looking at the 12 to 15 months period thereafter. And, just for people who may not remember, but when India's partition happened, there were certain princely states which were not incorporated. And the two largest ones were Hyderabad and Kashmir. And they were, in a sense, the inverse mirror images of each other. Hyderabad was a large Hindu majority ruled by a Nawab, a Muslim Nawab. Kashmir was opposite, Muslim majority ruled by a Hindu king, Hari Singh. And what I'm trying to do here is actually something very different, but it is based on all the trolling that I have done through research material over 20 years. So in each book, there are two threads. One is the Delhi thread, which is consistent across, which has three protagonists, which is Jawahar, Vallabh, and Dicky. So I'm taking these three sort of big figures and making them into flesh and blood characters, because I want people to try and understand how these decisions were taken by Jawaharlal Nehru, the first Prime Minister of India, Vallabhbhai Patel, who was the Deputy Prime Minister and the Home Minister, and Dicky Mountbatten, who's the last Viceroy in India, and stayed on as the the first Governor General of India. So I want to show how these trinity or triumvirate is taking those decisions. And then I want to pan to the particular location and say how the Aam Aadmi, the Mango people are dealing with it. So in Lahore, what is happening, and I have the characters there. And I'm doing the same with Hyderabad, where it is again, there's people there, but there's the Nizam, and then in Kashmir. And the thing is that in Hyderabad, one way or the other, we resolved the issue by within 12 months. In Kashmir, the issue is an ongoing one. And my hope is that with these three books, people may have a better appreciation of why, after 75 years, we're still going to war with Pakistan on every little occasion that we can, and why we need to start seeing our political leaders as flesh and blood people who made mistakes, but who also made some great decisions, and how they were not at each other's throat, they worked as a team. And these books are written as thrillers, because the time is a thriller. There is no time. It's like Ghalib has that wonderful sher, which is "Raw mein hai rakshe umr, kahan dekhiye thame." The time is like a horse in gallop, and na haath baag par hai, na paa hai rakaab mein. The hand is not on the rein and the feet are not on the stirrups. Because once the announcement for partition, independence happened, it was history overtaking everybody. And the pace is thrillerish. They're written as thrillers. And I hope, when people read it, they enjoy the book per se, and then they hopefully have a better appreciation for, all that we have as a people gone through, as a nation have gone through, and see what the stakes are for all of us.
I think it's very timely, Manreet. I think we all need to go back to the basics given what's unfurling around us today. I think if readers can, through fiction, know what our history is, because we're we're confusing fiction for history. So let fiction give us our history. I think that's a wonderful way of getting to it. Do we have any questions, Preeti? Arvind?
Yeah, so I first of all want to apologize, because we got all those weird people sending weird messages. So we actually disabled chat altogether and got rid of those people and locked the meeting, which is why we could not increase our numbers, because now we were only allowing the one or two people we actually know and recognize. So I'm sorry about that. It's not happened ever, but okay, there's always a first time, I guess. The other thing, I do want to apologize. I keep calling your novel Brilliance of, but it should be Radiance. But I'm always in my head, it's a brilliant novel and it has to be Brilliance. Forgive me for that also. We do have some questions which have come to, I think, Arvindaji, you've got them?
Yeah.
Or you're going to ask people to unmute and ask the questions.
Yeah, yeah.
One by
couple of
one,
questions.
we'll get the questions.
Manreet has already answered, like about the title of the book. She has already mentioned, and regarding the healing happening in the time soon for the from these events, you have already mentioned that. Now we have Qasim Jafri from Pakistan. He wished to ask a question, and I'm requesting him to please unmute yourself, and you may ask your question.
Hello, everybody. First of all, great narrative. I enjoyed it. I haven't read the book yet. I don't have a question, I have a couple of comments which might interest you. There is a Firozpur Road, as you would know, in Lahore, which is one of the three main arteries passing through the city. And it goes all the way to Firozpur via Kasur, where Bulle Shah shrine is. And then Ganda Singh Wala is the meeting point from where the road, Firozpur Road, actually enters the Indian part. And it's a major and one of the longest roads in Lahore. You would know that. I assume you've been to Lahore. Another interesting thing that I want to share with you, when I was a kid, my granny, my nani, had a friend, and we didn't know her name because she was known as Khala Firozpurni. And she passed away, and we still don't know her name because she was referred to as Firozpurni Khala. And that's how she was known throughout the city. So, you know, the bonds are there despite all the animosity or whatever you want to call it and whatever happened. I did not know so much detail about 1984, but I do remember that I was managing a hotel, a five-star hotel where the Indian team was staying, cricket team. They were in Lahore, and then I got a call from the High Commission, and I had to break the news of Mrs. Gandhi's assassination to them, and then the aftermath thereof. So they stayed on until things sort of normalized. So I was just a bystander, but I did read your book, and it was great conversation. Particularly the second half, I particularly enjoy. I must congratulations to all of you.
Thank you, Kashan. And then we have a question from Kamlesh Mohan. She's a lecturer. And she asks, how does a writer deal with the process of healing herself and other sufferers, especially, you know, women? It's a high time we shifted from narrating traumas to healing, narrating traumas to healing. So the question to you, Manreet.
It's a very good question. And, you know, I don't think I have a clear answer. I don't even know if an answer exists. I can tell you as a writer and as a person, as a mother, how I process it. As a writer, I very sort of simply put, once I am done with writing for the day, I usually head out for a long walk. And we live close enough to one of the parks in New York City. And, you know, it's a very safe place. And it's the kind of place where you can lose yourself. And I spend a lot of time just walking. You know, for me, as I said, I'm the daughter of farmers. Both my parents hail from farming families. And being in an environment where there are birds and trees is just so resuscitating. I think it is the balm that I need. The other thing, as I said earlier, was through friendships and love, you know, within your own family, within your own community. Love is, you know, it sounds like such a cliche, but love is what saves us all in the end, you know. And that is why we tell stories, because, you know, that is how we pass love on to others. I think the writing is a part of the healing for me. You know, once it's a way of putting it down and hoping that others can read it and take it forward and tell these stories. Because I do feel that storytelling and healing are interconnected. There's a reason why, you know, one of the first things we as human beings did is to sit around a fire and say, let me tell you a story. And of course, if you're a bad storyteller, you got lynched right at the moment. Thankfully, we don't have that peril. We just get bad reviews. You know?
And there's another one. It's from Gurpratap Khera. Now, he says, you talked about two names. You talked about the names of the characters in the book. There's Noora, Jyot, and Meher. Are these all intentional? Did you feel this the dearth of the narrative around the partition, just one movie, I think, Garam Hawa? How do you deal with it? And why do you think that is so?
So there are three questions, if I can get them. One is the naming of characters,
Exactly.
and then there is partition literature, and then how do I deal with it, right? Yeah, so I am very deliberate. I think all writers are. Maybe Kiran can also answer this question with naming my characters. And Noora and Jyot, for instance, are both synonyms for light in a way. You know, and it ties in again with the title of the novel, The Radiance of a Thousand Suns. So yes, I'm very deliberate with how I'm going to name my characters. And if you read the book, people will figure why Meher is called Meher, why Nikki is called Nikki, her mother. As for dealing with partition literature, yes, as I said, I think my writerly career has been devoted to reading a lot of partition literature, and in relation to the epochal size of it, we have very little literature. There is Hisham Sani's very fabulous Tamas, which I read in Hindi last year during lockdown, because I wanted to, get reacquainted with the language of my growing up years, which I don't read anymore. And Tamas is available as a TV series. I would urge everybody to watch it. It's on YouTube, I think. It's wonderful. And the third is, how do I deal with it? As I said, I deal with it by writing, by walking, by sort of spending time with my family. And my cat, I will bring her around right now. She's my literary assistant. And when you have an assistant who needs food every 3 hours or 2 hours, that keeps you grounded.
So we have another Dr. Gurup Tej Singh. I will request him to ask his question.
Am I audible?
Yeah, you are audible, sir.
Yeah. Thank you very much. First of all, I think it was a very refreshing and a very interesting talk. And my questions are born out of the curiosity that you have raised about the book. My first question is that you have talked about Heer and Draupadi as feminists. I would like you to tell us, how do you perceive them as feminists? We know the stories, we have heard so much, and there are a number of perspectives given on these two characters. We would like to know your perspective on why would you call them feminists. Second, as you are dealing with historical events, would you call yourself a historical novelist?
Okay, I think I'll answer your second question first. I don't call myself a historical novelist or any other kind of novelist. I call myself a writer. And the reason is very simple, that I write across what the publishing industry calls genres. But I feel that every book that I write requires a certain format. It wants to be told in a certain way, and I try and tell it in that way. So, whether it's literary fiction or thrillers or mysteries or light fiction or women's fiction. So yeah, that's what I am. I do write, my books deal with history. It's a very important part of, I think, all my books. And that is because I am vested in history, and I spend a lot of time actually in archives, in public libraries, to try and get the historical facts right, which I think is a responsibility that every writer bears, especially in a time when fake news and the ability to, as Kiran said, distinguish between fact and fiction has become so difficult. So especially for instance, writing The Radiance of a Thousand Suns, The Long Walk Home, and now with the Partition Trilogy, I have been scrupulous about the sources and going back to them. To answer your first question, why Heer and Draupadi are feminists, I mean, to me, it's not even something which wouldn't be obvious. I think when women start telling the stories of women characters, they see what these characters are trying to say and do. I'll just give one, the very idea that Heer, wanted to marry the man whom she loved at a time when, in very patriarchal Punjab, and the fact that she, stood by her love, is a woman who owns herself. She has autonomy in the way she wants to conduct her affairs. And Draupadi, what can I say about Draupadi? Draupadi is, the male narrators have positioned Draupadi as somebody who's the cause of the war. And Draupadi is the pivot around which the Mahabharata revolves. And I would urge people, when they say, is this woman a feminist? Don't do it like that. Just try and put yourself in the woman's heels or Kolhapuri chappals or Bata slippers, and try and walk in her footwear. And then you will see what her perspective is. being a feminist is just acknowledging that women has as much right as men do in this world. And there it ends.
Thank you. Thank you. Now, I think for Preeti ji.
Yes, I just have a couple of things to say about the forthcoming sessions. And then I would ask Jasmeet actually to wind up. Or maybe Jasmeet can come in first and then I'll tell you about next week. So Jasmeet, please.
Hello, hi Manreet and hi Kiran.
Hello.
I'm totally enamored by your interaction today. And Manreet, I'm totally impressed by your research ears. So much of research, I think this was news to me. The way you dealt with it. I know partitions are so painful to the mind. All partitions you've dealt with, families, minds, mindsets, leave aside the lands. And opening up of the traumatized minds was so beautifully done. And silence and violence and the people who commit violence, so correct. And they carry the scars with them all through, and they have to live with them. These are spine-chilling narratives, I must say. So thank you so much for giving us insight into a very collaborative 1,000 suns. Thank you. And thank you for the wonderful audience that we've had today. And this is a thank you, a gratitude. Thank you from the Majha House.
Yeah, Preeti ji,
Jasmeet.
we can conclude, and
I just want everybody to know about the programs that we have, because this is a month in which we are trying to do sessions as we are not able to do our usual festival. It's an online festival that we are trying to organize. So on the 16th, which is next Saturday, we have a talk by a very well-known writer from Nagaland, Easterine Kire. She is going to be talking on memory, personal memory and individual's memory, as well as community, how an entire community or a people remember. And so that should be really interesting to listen to. That's on the 16th, and she also has a moderator, a young Naga scholar and professor here from Delhi University, Vio. Both of them will be there on Saturday. And then on the 17th, which is Sunday, we have a session of poetry, but this poetry is war poetry. And we have Major General Hemant Kumar Singh, who will take us through this poetry and talk about memorializing and commemorating and looking at poetry in that way. And then on Tuesday, the 19th, we have a session on the poetry of Nasir Kazmi, which is being curated by Qasim, who is here with us today, and with Arinder Chamak, who is also here with us today. So these are the 3 things coming up. All of you will be getting Zoom codes and all of that. Please do join, and look forward to seeing you again. Thank you very much for being here.
Thank you so very much indeed. When you share Iqbal or when you share about Malik, like you would find Maliks in Sikhs also, in Hindus also, in Muslims also. Like I would just share a small couplet that kadi Eid Diwali sanjiyan san, kadi Eid Diwaliyan sanjiyan san, kadi Juliyan Kuliyan sanjiyan san, kadi Rajaiyan Vitsa si Roo Varge, kadi Pind diyan Tiyan sanjiyan san. So we were all together.
Absolutely. And we should do another session on Punjabiyat and why. I mean, the call for partition came from UP, and it impacted Punjab and Bengal. Such unfortunate turn of events. But
anyway, thank you so very much. It was indeed a wonderful session, and wish you good day now. It's your sunny day.
Thanks to Kiran, who is always so lovely, and sort of the best person for me to be in conversation with anytime. Kiran, thank you so much, and Preeti.
enjoyed each moment.
You guys are doing a great job at
Sure.
Majha House. Keep going. I will certainly try and join for one which is at a better hour. Maybe Rajmohan Gandhi, as you said, because his will be probably later.
Yeah. So God bless. Wish you good day.
Thank you so much.
Good night.
Thank you. Good night, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.